He didn't want trouble, just to look at an old rifle he used to carry long before most of them were even born. But the clerk laughed at his questions, mocked his limp, called him grandpa, and told him to leave. The old man didn't argue. He left quietly, like he always had, one step at a time. What the clerk didn't know was that the name on that man's dog tag still meant something. And exactly 1 hour later, an entire Navy SEAL team pulled into the parking lot. No sirens, no warnings. Just a dozen men walking in formation, dead silent, and asking one question: where is he? Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of disrespect, loyalty, and redemption, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe real warriors never forget their own, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The gun shop sat on the edge of town, nestled between a bait store and a hardware warehouse. Its windows were tinted just enough to give the illusion of authority, and inside, racks of rifles lined the walls like trophies. Glass counters displayed handguns too polished to look real, while behind the register, 2 young clerks leaned over their phones, half paying attention to the soft hum of country music playing from the ceiling speakers. The place wasn't busy, but it never needed to be. This was the kind of store that made its money on image, catering to weekend warriors and suburban tactical enthusiasts who wanted to feel dangerous without ever facing real danger. At exactly 10:43 a.m., the front door chimed. The man who entered didn't command attention. He simply existed in a way that made everything a little quieter. His worn boots clicked softly against the linoleum floor, each step deliberate but careful. He wore jeans that had been patched at the knee, a brown leather jacket older than half the staff, and a faded navy cap that had seen better decades. His face was weathered but calm, with eyes that were sharp under the brim of his cap. He moved slowly, not from weakness but from the kind of measured caution that comes from a lifetime of being aware of your surroundings. His limp was noticeable but never pitiful, the result of old wounds that had healed as well as they were going to. He didn't glance around at the tactical gear or the display of combat knives. He walked straight to the counter, rested his hand gently on the glass, and waited. The gesture was simple, patient, respectful, the behavior of a man who understood that good things came to those who waited their turn. One of the clerks, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22, looked up from his phone and gave the old man a forced smile. The kind of smile that said he was doing the customer a favor just by acknowledging his existence. "Need something, sir?" the clerk asked, though his tone suggested he was already planning to return to whatever was on his screen. The old man nodded once, his voice quiet but clear. "Yeah, wondering if you still carry the M1 Garand replica from the back wall. The real stock model." The kid blinked, as if the request had somehow confused him. "That's a collector's piece," he said slowly, "not something you'd want to fire. Probably too heavy for." "I didn't ask to fire it," the man interrupted gently. "Just wanted to hold it for a moment. Haven't touched one in decades." The second clerk, slightly older but not by much, stepped in with a chuckle that was meant to sound friendly but came across as condescending. "That rifle's heavier than it looks, Pops. Might be a bit much for your back." The old man's expression didn't change. His voice remained even, respectful. "I used to carry one across jungles. I think I can manage it across a showroom." That was when the tone in the room shifted. Not dramatically, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. The first clerk's forced smile faded slightly, replaced by something that looked like irritation mixed with amusement. "Okay, Rambo," the kid said, his voice carrying just enough mockery to cut. "Unless you're buying, you're just taking up space. Let the real customers in." The second clerk joined in, his laugh too loud and too sharp. "Yeah, we're not a museum, Gramps. You want to reminisce about the good old days? Try the VFW hall down the street." The old man stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. He looked down at the counter, then back up at the 2 young men who had just dismissed him like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, exactly, but the kind of quiet assessment that comes from a lifetime of measuring threats and determining responses. But instead of escalating, instead of demanding respect or pulling rank or reminding them of who he might have been, he simply nodded. "Understood," he said quietly. Then he turned around, walked to the door with that same measured pace, and left without another word. The clerks watched him go, already returning to their phones before the door had fully closed. Neither of them noticed the woman by the ammunition rack, mid-30s, wearing a gym shirt and ball cap pulled low, who had been shopping quietly in the corner. Neither of them saw her step outside 2 minutes later, pull a phone from her pocket, and make a single call. She said 3 words: "He was there." What the clerks didn't understand was that disrespecting a veteran is one thing. But disrespecting a Navy SEAL, especially one whose name still carried weight in certain circles, was something else entirely. And in exactly 1 hour, they were about to learn the difference. At 11:43 a.m., the parking lot in front of the gun shop began to fill, but not with customers. A matte black SUV pulled in and parked close to the entrance, its engine staying on. A minute later, another identical vehicle parked beside it. Then a third. No music, no movement, just quiet, humming machines with dark glass and the kind of presence that made people stop mid-step and look twice. Inside the store, the clerks were still joking, still scrolling through their phones, still completely unaware that the atmosphere outside was shifting like the air before a storm. Then the doors opened. 3 at once. And 12 men stepped out. Their movements were deliberate, unhurried, but carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. They weren't loud, they didn't shout or make demands or announce themselves. But something about their presence made people across the street pause their conversations and pay attention. Some wore civilian clothes, jeans and polo shirts that looked normal until you noticed how they moved, how they scanned their surroundings, how they positioned themselves with the automatic precision of people who had done this dance 1,000 times before. Others wore dress uniforms, ribbons and decorations catching the afternoon sunlight. Most didn't need either, the way they walked told you everything you needed to know about who they were. It was in their shoulders, in their eyes, in the way they naturally formed a loose formation without anyone giving orders. These weren't men playing soldier. These were soldiers who had stopped playing a long time ago. They crossed the sidewalk in silence and stepped through the front door one by one. The chime rang softly as they entered, and even that innocent sound seemed different now, less like a greeting and more like an announcement that something important was about to happen. The youngest clerk, still seated on his stool behind the register, barely looked up from his phone. "Welcome in, gents," he said without much interest. "Looking for anything specific today?" Then he glanced up and froze. 12 men stood in a calm semicircular formation facing the counter, their presence filling the small store like water filling a glass. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply stood there, eyes locked on him, waiting. The oldest among them, a man with graying hair, a square jaw, and a chest bearing rows of ribbons that told stories most people couldn't read, stepped forward slightly. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it hit with the force of something much heavier. "An hour ago," he said evenly, "one of us walked through that door." The second clerk, who had been pretending to organize inventory, stopped what he was doing and turned around. His casual confidence was already starting to crack around the edges. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." The man cut him off with nothing but a look. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just the kind of steady gaze that had been perfected in places where words were luxuries and clarity was survival. "He didn't come here to be honored," the SEAL continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Didn't ask to be recognized. He just wanted to see a rifle he hadn't touched since Vietnam. Your staff laughed. Called him Grandpa. Told him to leave. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, setting it gently on the counter. It was a scorched military patch, folded and worn, the kind of thing that had been through hell and somehow survived. "He pulled this off my uniform when I was bleeding out in Helmand," the man said quietly. "Carried me out on foot. 22 hours with no radio, no backup, and a hole in his side the size of a fist. He never told anyone about it. Never asked for thanks. But when he walked in here today, you treated him like a problem." The younger clerk's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The bravado, the casual dismissal, the easy mockery, it all evaporated in the face of something real. "We're not here for revenge," the SEAL said, his tone remaining calm and measured. "We don't need an apology. But he won't speak for himself, so we're speaking for him." Another SEAL stepped forward and placed a photograph on the glass counter. 8 men in desert camouflage, arms slung over shoulders, dust-caked and sunburned but smiling. The man in the center, younger then but unmistakable now, was the same quiet figure they had mocked an hour earlier. "The man you laughed at," the first SEAL continued, "earned 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and a Distinguished Service Cross. He saved more lives than most people will ever touch. And he's been cutting hair in this town for 15 years, never saying a word about any of it." The clerk's face had gone pale. I didn't know." "Exactly," the SEAL said, his voice carrying a finality that closed the conversation. "You didn't ask. No threats. No demands. Just truth, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard." Then, as silently as they had arrived, the first man turned. The others followed. 12 men walking out the same way they had come in, without fanfare, without drama, just leaving behind a silence that no bullet could replicate. Outside, a small crowd had started to gather, drawn by instinct more than curiosity. Phones came out, not to film but to record, just in case anyone forgot how it felt to see something like this. The SEALs didn't acknowledge them. They didn't need to. They got back in their vehicles and drove off, one after another, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Because inside the shop, the air didn't return to normal. The joke-filled atmosphere, the casual disrespect, the easy dismissal of someone they didn't understand, it was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they had just encountered something they weren't equipped to handle. The clerk sat down slowly, staring at the photo still sitting on the counter in front of him. For the first time, he realized he hadn't just thrown out an old man. He had dismissed history. And now the entire world was about to learn exactly who they had really pushed out the door. By 1:45 p.m., the photo had already gone viral in 3 veteran Facebook groups. It was taken by a customer who had walked in just after the SEALs arrived, 12 men standing in complete silence inside the gun shop, all facing the counter where 2 clerks stood frozen behind the register. No fists, no shouting, just stillness and a presence too heavy to ignore. The caption simply read, "When you disrespect a SEAL, you get all of them." At first, most people didn't understand the context. The post was shared and reshared, often with nothing but the American flag emoji. Then someone asked, who was the old man they were standing for? And that's when everything changed. By 2:12 p.m., a name emerged in the comments. James C. Beckett, a man who had been seen around town for years but never spoken about much. Always polite, always alone, wearing the same beat-up SEAL Team 3 cap every day. No one had ever asked what it meant. Until now. One commenter wrote, "He was my uncle's CO in '91. Saved 3 men in Panama. Didn't talk about it once after coming home." Another added, "If that's Beckett, we're talking about a real ghost. The kind of guy you only hear about in briefings, never in the news." Someone found a grainy scanned personnel summary buried in a military archive and uploaded it under the photo. Master Chief Special Warfare Operator James Charles Beckett, SEAL Team 3. Joined in 1966, retired in 2004. Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart, multiple unlisted commendations. Records showing service across Vietnam, Mogadishu, Panama, and Iraq. Over 35 confirmed personnel extractions in hostile zones. No autobiography, no press coverage, no interviews. Just decades of silence and decades of doing the job. By 3 p.m., the local news station had picked up the story, titled simply, "Silent Visit, 12 Navy SEALs Show Up at Gun Store in Support of Local Veteran." The article gave no sensationalist details, just facts. A man had come in, he'd been asked to leave, an hour later a team arrived. And suddenly, a quiet, overlooked figure had become a symbol of everything people had forgotten to respect. At the shop, the silence hadn't lifted. The clerks hadn't spoken to one another in over an hour. The photograph left behind by the SEALs sat on the counter, showing 8 men in black and white, standing in the desert, muddy and sunburnt and young, but their eyes were hard. Beckett was in the middle, standing with arms crossed and a half-smile that said nothing and everything at once. Customers who came in later didn't ask about ammunition or gear. They asked who the man in the photo was. They asked if he was coming back. One older customer, a Marine from Desert Storm, stood at the counter, stared at the photo for a full minute, then saluted it and walked out without saying a word. By 4 p.m., a veteran-owned publication had published a short piece titled, "The Ones Who Stand When You're Gone." It ended with a line that would be quoted thousands of times over the following days: James Beckett didn't need to speak. His silence was covered by 12 voices who chose not to raise theirs either. Back inside the store, the manager arrived, pale and holding his phone in one hand, trying to process what had just happened. The photo had been sent to him twice already before he even pulled into the parking lot. The scorched flag patch that had been left on the counter remained untouched, no one had dared to move it. He didn't blame the clerks. He didn't even speak to them. He simply walked to the display case, took out the M1 Garand the old man had asked to see, and placed it on the counter beside the photo. Then he took a sheet of paper, wrote something by hand, and slid it into a clear frame next to the weapon. No fanfare, just a line of text that read, "He carried it once. We'll carry the memory now." Outside the store, someone had placed a single white flower against the door. Then a challenge coin. Then a folded piece of paper with nothing but the word "respect" written in block letters. By nightfall, a small crowd had gathered, not to protest, not to chant, not to demand anything. Just to stand quietly in the kind of reverent hush that said more than 1,000 headlines ever could. As for Beckett, he didn't respond to the coverage. Didn't post, didn't grant interviews, didn't acknowledge the online wave building behind him. He wasn't even aware of most of it. He went home the same way he'd arrived, unnoticed, unassuming, and unbothered by the world's sudden interest in his story. But for the first time in years, when someone passed him on the sidewalk, they didn't glance past him. They looked twice. Because now the town knew exactly who they'd asked to leave and who had answered in his place. In the days that followed, something shifted in the small community. Not dramatically, not publicly, but deeply. The gun shop, once just another business with a cash register and a rack of tactical gear, became something else. It wasn't about weapons anymore. It was about memory. People came not to shop but to reflect. Veterans walked through the door not with a shopping list but with stories. Some left patches from their own units beside Beckett's photo. Others asked quietly, "Is he okay?" No one really knew the truth. The truth was that James Beckett hadn't changed his routine. He still walked 2 miles every morning before the sun got too high. Still stopped at the same corner diner for black coffee with no sugar. Still sat alone at the back booth, the one no one ever asked to share. And he never once mentioned the day he was thrown out or the men who showed up behind him. But people noticed anyway. When a local high school invited veterans to speak in history class, Beckett didn't reply. But the week after, the principal received an envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter describing a rescue operation in 1970. No name, no signature, just a map reference and the names of the 6 men saved. It was framed and hung in the school hallway without ceremony. The message had traveled through networks that most people didn't know existed. Not social media, not news outlets, but the quiet communications that connect warriors across generations and geography. A text here, a phone call there, word passed from one team room to another until it reached the right people in the right places. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez was in Virginia Beach when she got the call. Master Sergeant Mike Thompson was at Fort Bragg. Sergeant First Class Alex Rivera was on leave in San Diego. None of them had served directly with Beckett, but they all knew someone who had. And more importantly, they all understood what it meant when one of their own was disrespected. The response wasn't coordinated by any official channel. No orders were given, no meetings held, no formal plans made. It was something deeper than that, the kind of automatic reaction that happens when people who have shared certain experiences recognize that one of their brotherhood needs backup. 2 weeks after the gun shop incident, they came to Beckett's diner. Not all at once, not in uniform, not making a scene. Just quietly, respectfully, one after another, until the small restaurant was filled with a particular kind of customer that the staff had never seen before. They didn't take over the place. They didn't demand special treatment. They simply ordered coffee, sat at different tables, and waited. Because they knew that eventually, Beckett would arrive for his usual morning routine, and when he did, he wouldn't be sitting alone. At 7:23 a.m., Beckett walked through the door just like he had for the past 15 years. Black coffee, back booth, newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle. He moved with his usual quiet efficiency, nodding politely to the waitress, settling into his spot with the practiced ease of someone who had found his rhythm and stuck to it. But today, something was different. As he sat down, Martinez stood up from her table 2 booths over. She was small, dark-haired, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide the way she carried herself. She walked over slowly, respectfully, and stopped beside his table. "Master Chief," she said quietly. "Mind if we join you?" Beckett looked up from his newspaper, taking in not just Martinez but the dozen other people scattered throughout the diner. Men and women of different ages, different backgrounds, but all carrying themselves with a familiarity he recognized immediately. His eyes moved from face to face, reading the signs that civilians would miss, the posture, the awareness, the quiet confidence that came from shared experience. "You're all," he began. "Different units, different eras," Thompson said, standing up from his corner table. "But same brotherhood." Rivera nodded from near the counter. "Word gets around, Master Chief. What happened at that gun shop, it shouldn't have." For a moment, Beckett just sat there, processing what was happening. In 15 years of quiet mornings and solitary coffee, no one had ever asked to join him. He'd grown comfortable with the isolation, perhaps even protective of it. But looking at these faces, these people who understood things that most of the world would never have to understand, something in his chest loosened slightly. "I don't need," he started. "We know," Martinez said gently. "You never asked for backup. You never asked for recognition. But sometimes backup shows up anyway." The waitress, who had been watching this interaction with growing curiosity, approached the table tentatively. Do you folks want to move some tables together?" Beckett looked around the diner again, at all these strangers who weren't strangers, at people who had come from hundreds of miles away just to sit with him while he drank his coffee. After a long moment, he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That would be good." What followed wasn't a dramatic reunion or an emotional outpouring of war stories. It was just people sharing coffee and conversation, talking about everything except the reasons they were all there. They discussed the weather, local politics, the quality of the diner's pie. Normal things. human things. But underneath the casual conversation was something deeper, a recognition, a mutual respect, an understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. These were people who had seen things, done things, carried burdens that they would never fully explain to civilians. And for this one morning, none of them had to carry those burdens alone. The manager of the diner, a former army cook named Pete, watched the scene unfold from behind the counter. He'd served plenty of veterans over the years, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. Not the drama of a reunion, but the quiet power of people who understood each other without having to explain themselves. When it came time to pay, Beckett reached for his wallet, but Martinez was already standing. "It's covered, Master Chief." "All of it," Thompson added. "For everyone." Beckett started to protest, but Rivera shook his head. "Let us do this. It's not charity. It's respect." As they began to file out, each person stopped by Beckett's table. Not for long conversations or emotional goodbyes, just a handshake, a nod, sometimes a simple, "thank you." Some left challenge coins on the table. Others left patches. One left a small American flag, folded tight and worn smooth. Martinez was the last to leave. She paused beside his table and placed a business card face down on the surface. "If you ever need anything," she said. "And I mean anything. Day or night." After they were gone, Beckett sat alone in the diner, surrounded by the small tokens they'd left behind. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of connection, full of understanding, full of the knowledge that while he might choose to live quietly, he wasn't forgotten. Pete walked over with a fresh cup of coffee. "Hell of a thing," he said, refilling Beckett's cup. Beckett nodded, running his thumb over one of the challenge coins. "Yeah," he said softly. "Hell of a thing." That afternoon, word spread through the veteran networks again. Not about the gun shop this time, but about the diner. About coffee and respect and the way Brotherhood works when it's real. And in the days that followed, Beckett's morning routine stayed the same time, same booth, same black coffee. But he was never alone again. The story didn't end with coffee in a small-town diner. Stories like this never do. They spread, evolve, and take on lives of their own, touching people in ways that the original participants never intended or expected. 3 days after the diner gathering, a video appeared on social media. Not of the gun shop incident, that had been captured only in photographs, but of something entirely unexpected. A young Marine, stationed at Camp Pendleton, had been inspired by Beckett's story to look up his own grandfather's service record. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about the quiet old man who had raised him. "My grandfather never talked about the war," the Marine said into his phone camera, standing outside the small apartment where his grandfather lived alone. "Never. I mean, I knew he served, but he always changed the subject when I asked. After hearing about Master Chief Beckett, I decided to do some digging." The video showed him holding a folder of declassified documents, his hands shaking slightly as he read. "My grandfather, who I've been calling Grandpa Joe my whole life, is Staff Sergeant Joseph Martinez, recipient of the Medal of Honor for actions at Khe Sanh. He single-handedly held off a North Vietnamese assault for 6 hours, allowing his unit to evacuate wounded. And he never told anyone." The camera followed the young Marine as he knocked on his grandfather's door, documents in hand. The conversation that followed was private, the video cut away respectfully, but the impact was clear. By the end of the week, #QuietHeroes was trending, with hundreds of people sharing stories of veterans in their own families who had never spoken about their service. Back in Beckett's town, the ripple effects were more immediate and personal. The gun shop, once a symbol of casual disrespect, had become an unexpected pilgrimage site. Not for protests or drama, but for reflection. The M1 Garand still sat on the counter, now accompanied by flowers, coins, and handwritten notes from visitors. The manager, overwhelmed by the attention, made a decision that surprised everyone. He converted the back corner of the shop into a small memorial space, not for Beckett specifically, but for all the quiet veterans who had never asked for recognition. Local historians donated photographs and artifacts. A retired teacher volunteered to research the stories of area veterans and create small displays honoring their service. The clerks who had originally dismissed Beckett were no longer with the store. Not because they were fired, but because they had quit. One left a note explaining that he was enlisting in the army, hoping to understand what he had failed to recognize. The other enrolled in college, switching his major to history with a focus on military service. But perhaps the most significant change happened at the diner where Beckett had his coffee every morning. What had started as a one-time gathering of veterans had evolved into something more permanent. Every Tuesday at 7:30 a.m., a small group would meet there, not the same people every week, but always veterans, always respectful, always quiet. They called it Coffee and Questions, an informal gathering where younger veterans could sit with older ones, where stories could be shared without judgment, where the burdens of service could be lightened by the simple act of being understood. Pete, the diner owner, had initially worried about how to handle the weekly influx of customers. But he quickly realized that these weren't just customers, they were a community. They tipped well, they were polite to staff, and they brought a sense of purpose to his small business that he'd never experienced before. It's not about the money, Pete explained to a local reporter who had come to cover the phenomenon. These people, they've given everything for this country. The least I can do is make sure they have a good cup of coffee and a place to sit. The reporter asked if Beckett still came in every morning. Every day, Pete nodded. Same time, same booth, same order. But now he's got company. And I think that's what he needed, even if he didn't know it. The story had reached beyond the local community, beyond even the veteran networks. Military families across the country were using Beckett's example to start conversations with their own quiet heroes. Support groups were forming, both online and in person, for veterans who had spent decades carrying their stories alone. A non-profit organization called Silent Service was founded specifically to connect older veterans with younger ones, to create the kind of community that Beckett had found in that diner. Their mission statement was simple: every veteran has a story. Every story has value. No one should carry their story alone. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in veteran mental health, published a paper about what she called the Beckett effect, the therapeutic value of peer support among veterans across generational lines. What we saw in this small town, she wrote, was a masterclass in how community healing actually works. It wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. It was recognition, respect, and the simple acknowledgement that someone's service and sacrifice mattered. But in all the analysis, all the articles, all the social media posts and academic papers, the most important part of the story remained unchanged. Every morning at 7:30, Beckett still walked into that diner, ordered his black coffee, and sat at his usual booth. The difference was that now, when he looked around the room, he saw faces that understood. He saw people who had walked similar paths, carried similar burdens, and made similar choices to serve something bigger than themselves. And for the first time in decades, the silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. It was shared. It was the silence of people who didn't need to explain themselves because they were finally, truly understood. 6 months after the gun shop incident, Beckett was cutting his lawn when a car pulled into his driveway. Nothing unusual about that. He'd grown accustomed to the occasional visitor, though he still preferred his privacy. What was unusual was the passenger who stepped out, a young woman in dress blues, her military bearing unmistakable even before he noticed the Naval Academy ring on her finger. "Master Chief Beckett?" she asked, approaching with the kind of respectful formality that told him she'd done her homework. "Just James now," he replied, shutting off his mower. "Retired a long time ago. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I wanted to speak with you personally." She paused, gathering her words. "I'm the new commanding officer of SEAL Team 3, your old unit." Beckett studied her for a moment, the pressed uniform, the confident posture, the slight nervousness that came with addressing a legend. "Team 3, huh? How are the boys doing?" "That's actually why I'm here, sir. I wanted to let you know that the team voted unanimously to name our new training facility after you. The Beckett Center for Leadership Excellence. We'd like you to be there for the dedication ceremony." For a long moment, Beckett didn't respond. He looked at his half-mowed lawn, at the simple house he'd called home for 2 decades, at the ordinary life he'd built after extraordinary service. The idea of his name on a building, of being the center of attention at a military ceremony, felt foreign and uncomfortable. "I appreciate the thought," he said finally. "But I'm not much for ceremonies. Never was." Lieutenant Chen smiled. "The team anticipated you might say that, sir. They asked me to tell you that it's not about you having to stand up and give speeches. It's about them having a place to remember what leadership actually looks like." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a letter, folded but not creased, handled with obvious care. "This is from Petty Officer Marcus Johnson. He's currently deployed, but he wanted you to read this." Beckett took the letter, unfolded it, and read silently. His expression didn't change, but Chen noticed his hands tighten slightly on the paper. "He says you saved his father's life in Mogadishu," Chen said quietly. "Says his dad never talked about it, but after the story came out about what happened here, he finally opened up. Marcus enlisted because of what his father told him about you. There are 12 other guys on the team with similar stories." Beckett refolded the letter carefully, running his thumb along the crease. "Their fathers were the heroes. I just did my job." "Maybe," Chen said. "But your job saved their fathers. And their fathers raised sons who wanted to serve. And those sons are now protecting other people's children. That's legacy, sir. Whether you asked for it or not. That evening, Beckett sat on his porch, reading the letter again as the sun set behind the trees. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in the way that small towns could be. Children rode bicycles in the distance, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Families were having dinner, watching television, living the ordinary lives that he and thousands of others had fought to protect. The next morning, he showed up at the diner earlier than usual. Pete was still setting up, arranging chairs and wiping down tables before the breakfast rush. "You're early today, James," Pete said, looking up from his work. "Got something to ask you," Beckett replied, settling into his usual booth. "You know about the ceremony they want to do? The naming thing." Pete nodded. He'd heard about it from the other veterans who came in for coffee and questions. "The whole town's talking about it. Proud as hell, if you ask me. Thing is," Beckett said slowly, "I've been thinking about what that young officer said. About legacy. About the kids who grew up because their fathers came home." Pete poured coffee without being asked, settling into the routine they'd established over months of these conversations. "And maybe it's not about me," Beckett continued. "Maybe it's about them. The ones who are serving now, the ones who will serve later. Maybe having a place that reminds them that leadership isn't about glory, maybe that matters." When the other veterans arrived for their usual Tuesday gathering, Beckett was still there, the letter spread out on the table in front of him. Martinez, who had become something of a regular despite living 3 hours away, slid into the booth across from him. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" she said, not really asking. Beckett looked around the table at the faces that had become familiar over the past months. Thompson, who drove down from Fort Bragg every few weeks. Rivera, who coordinated his leave time so he could be there. A dozen others who had somehow made this small diner in a small town the center of something important. "On one condition," he said finally. "It's not just about me. It's about all of us. Every quiet professional who did the job and came home. Everyone who didn't. The ceremony happens here, in this town, so these people can see what real honor looks like." 3 weeks later, Main Street was filled with uniforms. Not just SEALs, but Marines, Army, Air Force, Coast Guard, veterans from 6 decades of service who had traveled from across the country to honor one of their own. The gun shop that had started it all was decorated with flags and flowers, its windows displaying photographs of local veterans from every era. The ceremony itself was simple, dignified, and exactly what Beckett would have wanted. No politicians, no long speeches, no media circus. Just warriors honoring a warrior, and a community learning what service actually meant. When it came time for Beckett to speak, he walked to the small podium that had been set up in front of the diner and looked out at the crowd. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly veterans stood at attention despite their age, and active duty service members filled the spaces between. "I'm not good with speeches," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Never was. But I want to say something about the young man who asked to see that rifle 6 months ago. About the kids in uniform standing here today. About the people in this town who learned to see us differently." He paused, looking down at the letter from Petty Officer Johnson, then back up at the crowd. "Service isn't about being thanked. It's not about ceremonies or buildings with your name on them. It's about knowing that somewhere, children are safe enough to ride bicycles in the street. It's about families having dinner together. It's about a country where young people can choose to serve because they want to, not because they have to." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "The young SEALs who will train in that facility won't be learning about James Beckett. They'll be learning about dedication, about sacrifice, about the difference between serving yourself and serving something greater. And when they graduate, when they take their place in the teams, they'll carry forward the same truth that every generation of warriors has carried. We don't serve for recognition. We serve for love." He stepped away from the podium, but the crowd remained silent for a long moment. Then, without prompting, a single person began to clap. Then another. Soon the entire street was filled with applause, but it wasn't for Beckett alone. It was for every veteran present, every story untold, every sacrifice made in silence. That evening, as the visitors departed and the town returned to its normal rhythm, Beckett sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The street was quiet again, peaceful in the way that had drawn him here 2 decades earlier. His phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Chen, "The first class graduates in 6 months. You're invited to watch them earn their trident. No speeches required." Beckett smiled, typed back a simple "Roger that," and returned to his peaceful evening. Because that's what legacy really looks like, not monuments or ceremonies, but the quiet knowledge that the work continues, that the next generation is ready, and that somewhere, children will always be safe enough to ride their bicycles in the street. Some heroes wear capes. Others wear aprons. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up, do your job, and trust that someone, somewhere, is paying attention to how it's done. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like James Beckett? Someone whose quiet service deserved recognition but never asked for it? Share their story in the comments. Tell us who they were and what they meant to you. Because here at Silent Heroes, we believe that the most powerful stories don't always make headlines. Sometimes they unfold in gun shops and diners, in the space between disrespect and redemption, in the moment when a community learns to see honor hiding in plain sight. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Help us keep these voices alive, these stories remembered, these quiet heroes honored. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, the next time you encounter someone whose service isn't obvious, whose sacrifice isn't advertised, whose heroism doesn't announce itself, take a closer look. You might be standing next to history itself.